summary of our current location with the ability to navigate to a different location and the option to change workspaces within Bridge, as well as some other controls for viewing the images. Most of the space in Bridge is taken up by panels. You can see here, for example, I have a Favorites panel and a Folders panel, as well as a Content panel and a Preview panel, among others. These panels provide access to the various things we need. For example, the ability to navigate to a particular folder, the ability to view our images and maybe select a particular image, and also the option to review metadata about the photos, for example. We can switch among the various panels just by clicking on the tab for that panel. But I think one of the most important things to keep in mind when it comes to these panels is that they're modular. When you switch among various workspaces, you'll see that the panel arrangement changes. The beauty of this, of course, is that you can configure the Bridge interface to suit your particular needs at any given time. Down below the assortment of panels, we'll find the status bar, and the status bar will indicate, for example, how many images are in the current folder, how many images are selected. It provides an opportunity to adjust the size of the thumbnail display, as well as to change the overall display of our images. So that provides you with a basic overview of the Bridge interface so that you'll have a general sense of what's going on. And of course, as you continue working with your images in Bridge, you'll get a better sense of which specific panels you want to have available at any given time, and you'll be better equipped to organize your images and locate those images later. When you capture new images, of course, you'll need to download those images onto your computer or an external hard drive, and Bridge provides a tool for doing exactly that. Let's take a look at how we can download new captures and place them into a folder so that we can view and manage them with Bridge. We can get started by going to the File menu and choosing Get Photos from Camera, but there's also a shortcut on the toolbar. It's a camera with a downward pointing arrow. I'll go ahead and click that button, and that will bring up the Adobe Bridge Photo Downloader. If you've connected a camera directly to the computer, it will most likely be automatically detected, and generally speaking, the same will be true if you've connected a card reader to your camera. But if the device is not found, you can click the pop-up and choose to refresh the list if the device does not appear, or you can simply choose the device. So in this case, for example, I have a card reader attached, and I will choose that as the source of images. As soon as I set that source, you can see that I have an indication of how many files will be imported and the total size of those files. In this case, I just have a small collection of JPEG captures, and so the file sizes are not all that large. I can then specify the import settings, starting with the location where I want to copy these images. I'll go ahead and click the Browse button, and then I can navigate to a particular location that I want to use for storing all of my photos. This could be, for example, an external hard drive that you use exclusively for storing your photos, or a particular folder somewhere on your computer. By specifying that primary location, you're creating a simpler workflow for downloading your images. Of course, we don't want all of our photos to go into the exact same folder on the exact same device, and so we'll create a subfolder. And so I'll go ahead and choose an option from the pop-up. I can choose not to create a subfolder if I want to, or I can use today's date or the capture date for my photos as a folder name, but I'm going to use a custom name. I'll go ahead and click the custom name option, and then in the text box below, I can type a name for the folder. You'll notice now that the location has been updated to indicate that folder name. I can also rename my images. Of course, when the camera creates the file in the first place, the file name is essentially just a serial number, and so it's not all that useful. But you can create your own custom file names if you'd like. I'll click the pop-up, and I'll use a custom name option. So I'll go ahead and click custom name, and in this case, I'll just call the files Paris, since these images were captured in Paris. I can also specify the starting sequence number. In this case, this is the first set of images that I captured from this particular trip, and so I'll start the sequence with 1. If I've already done some work with these images, perhaps with another application, I can also turn on the checkbox to preserve the current file name, in other words, the original file name, in the XMP metadata for the images. But I'm not concerned about that in this case because I've not worked with these images yet, so I can just simply rename them right from the start. Next, we have a checkbox for Open Adobe Bridge, and that means that once the download is complete, Bridge will launch. Of course, Bridge is already launched, so I don't need to have it launched once again, so I'll go ahead and turn off that checkbox. We can also convert our raw captures to the DNG file format, but I'm not going to take advantage of that feature, so I'll leave that checkbox turned off. We can also delete the original files if we'd like, but in most cases I leave this option turned off. For example, if I'm downloading images from my media card taken out of my camera, I will then, when the process is finished, put that card back in the camera and reformat it in order to initialize it. This provides one extra safeguard so that I can, for example, back up my images before I reformat the card. In some cases, though, you may want to turn this option on. For example, when you're downloading images from a smartphone, more often than not, it's more convenient to delete as part of the download process rather than having to manually delete those photos later. We can also create a backup copy of our photos during this download process. To do so, we can simply turn on the checkbox and then choose a location where we'd like to back up the images. Ideally, that backup copy should be stored on a separate physical hard drive. I'll go ahead and click the Browse button and then navigate to another location where I can save my backup copies. Note that we also have the option to display an advanced dialog. This primarily means that we'll see a series of thumbnails that allows us to review the images to make sure we're downloading the correct photos, and we could also turn off the checkbox for any photo we don't want to download. In most cases, though, I prefer to download everything and then review and delete later as needed. But with the advanced dialog, we also have the option to apply some metadata to our images. We can add, for example, the name of the photographer as well as copyright information if we'd like to. For now, I'll just leave those options blank. I can always apply a metadata template later, so I'll click the standard dialog button to get back to the primary dialog for the photo downloader. And at this point, I have all of my settings established, so I can simply click the Get Media button, and Bridge will copy all of my images to the folder that I specified. And with that process complete, I'm ready to start reviewing those images so I can get them organized. Bridge is obviously a somewhat complicated application, providing you with a wide variety of tools for managing and organizing your photos. And of course, different photographers will prefer to work in different ways within Bridge, such as by switching between different workspaces or even creating your own custom workspace. But we can also fine-tune some settings within Preferences. To get to the Preferences dialog, simply choose Edit Preferences on Windows or Bridge Preferences on Macintosh. That will bring up the Preferences dialog, which includes a number of pages of settings that we can adjust based on our personal preference. On the General page, we can first adjust the appearance, for example, choosing among the various color themes, which are essentially brightness settings, as it were, for the Bridge interface. You can choose from the preset themes or adjust with a slider. In most cases, I prefer to use a slightly darkened version of the interface, so I'll stick with the default. We can also adjust the shade of gray for the backdrop that falls behind our images, and here again I tend to leave the setting at about its default value. We can also change the accent color, and that's the color that's used, for example, to identify selections. Over here on the Folders panel, for example, we can see that the Paris folder is highlighted, but I can also change that accent color if I'd like. In the Behavior section, we have a couple of checkboxes. The first is double-click Edits Camera Raw Settings in Bridge. And what that means is that if you double-click a raw capture in Bridge, Adobe Camera Raw will appear, but the image will not actually get opened in Photoshop unless you click the Open Image button. If you simply click the Done button, then you'll have been able to adjust the raw settings without actually opening the image. And that can be convenient in certain situations, so you might want to turn this option on. We can also specify that a Control click or Command click on Macintosh is required in order to bring up the loop view when you're previewing an image. By default, you simply need to click on the image, but if you find that you inadvertently bring up the loop when it's not really wanted, you can turn on this checkbox so that the Control or Command key is required in order to bring up the loop. You can also specify how many items should appear on the Open Recent menu. The default is 10, and that's perfectly fine by me. And then we can choose which specific items we want to appear on the Favorites panel. In essence, any locations that you tend to navigate to on a regular basis, you'll want to make sure are checked here. And any locations that you don't tend to use, you can turn off so they don't clutter the display if you like. We also have a button that allows us to reset all of the warning dialogues. In many of the warning dialogues in Bridge, you'll have a checkbox that allows you to tell Bridge not to show you that specific warning in the future. But if you decide that you want those warnings to return, you can click the Reset button and all of those warnings will be reset so that they will appear as applicable, although you do have the option once again to turn on that checkbox for individual alerts. Going to the thumbnails page, you'll see that we have an option to not process files larger than 1,000 megabytes or 1 gigabyte. And what that enables us to do is to improve performance in situations where we have very large images. For example, if you create a large composite panorama, you might not want Bridge to create a thumbnail or preview for that specific image since it is so large and obviously then will take a significant amount of time to process. If you tend to work on large images and want to have those images visible in Bridge, you may need to raise this value, but for most users, I think the default setting here is perfectly fine. We can also choose to show additional information in the details display. If you utilize the details display and you want additional items to be shown, you can turn on the Show checkbox and then choose a specific item from the pop-up list. For example, perhaps you want to display exposure information. And we can also choose for that details display if we want a tooltip display to appear when we hover the mouse over the image. Next, we'll go to playback, and there we can choose a playback rate for stacks. So if you utilize stacks, how many images per second do you want to play back if you choose to play that stack? We can also choose whether we want audio and video files to play automatically, and whether we want that playback to be looped. On the metadata page, we can choose which specific metadata values we want to appear on the metadata tab. If there are particular values you don't care about, you could turn those off, and if there are items that you would like to see, for example, maybe the rating and label, you can turn those options on. Note that there are also checkboxes down below, one to hide any empty fields, so that if there's no value in a particular metadata field, that field simply won't be shown. And we can also choose whether or not we want to view the metadata placard. With this option turned on, we're able to see a summary of capture information on the metadata panel. Under keywords, we have a few options that mostly relate to hierarchical keywords. So, for example, we can choose whether or not we want to apply parent keywords when we assign a child keyword. So, for example, if we had a keyword of Paris and the parent of that keyword was France, we can have the France keyword automatically assigned to the image anytime we add the Paris keyword. We can also specify if we want to write hierarchical keywords to our images. Now, keywords in metadata actually don't truly support a hierarchy, but we can create a hierarchy by using the pipe symbol or the slash, backslash, or colon symbols. If you want to utilize hierarchical keywords, you can turn on the checkbox and then specify what the separator will be. Because hierarchical keywords are not supported consistently by various software applications, I prefer not to put them to use. However, I will leave the Read Hierarchical Keywords option turned on so that if I have any images that previously did have hierarchical keywords, they will still be displayed as such within Bridge. On the Labels page, we can choose whether or not we want to require the Control key in order to apply labels and ratings. I prefer to have this option turned off so that, for example, I can assign a star rating simply by pressing the numbers 1 through 5 rather than having to hold the Control key. On Macintosh, of course, that would be the Command key rather than the Control key. And you can see that the same thing applies for color labels. We have the number 6 through 9 for the red, yellow, green, and blue color labels. And so with the checkbox turned off, I can simply press those numbers. I can also change the word associated with a color label. When we add a color label, we're not actually adding a color per se to metadata, but rather adding a word that indicates what that color would be. You can see that the defaults in Bridge are select, second, approved, etc. The problem is this doesn't match what other applications, such as Adobe Photoshop Lightroom, use. So you might want to change these to the actual words, red, yellow, green, etc. The most important thing is to be consistent, so if you're already using color labels, then you probably want to leave these at their defaults, but it is an issue worth being aware of. Next, we have file type associations, and here we can specify which application should be used to launch specific file types. So, for example, you can see that the CompuServe GIF file format will be opened in Photoshop, but I can also change that to another application if I'd like to. On the Cache tab, we'll have some options that, of course, relate to the cache in Bridge. And this is essentially a temporary storage area where Bridge maintains previews of our photos so that they don't have to be re-rendered every time we browse an image. We can choose to keep 100% previews in cache so that if we zoom in on a photo, for example, we won't have to re-render it each time. We can also choose to export the cache to the individual folders along with the images if we want to. By default, the cache is stored in a central location. But for example, if you have images on an external hard drive and you want to be able to move that drive among various computers without having to rebuild the cache with different computers, you can turn this option on. You can also specify the location for the central cache. In most cases, though, there's no need to move this to a different location. But if you do have an additional internal hard drive separate of your operating system's hard drive, it can improve performance to move the cache to a different location. You can also specify the size of the cache. The slider is not really labeled for a specific value. It's just a rough sense, essentially, but the range goes from 10,000 images through 500,000 images. A larger cache can help improve performance because it means previews don't need to be rendered on the fly for images as you browse them, but it also consumes a fair amount of disk space, so you may need to balance this depending on your particular configuration. You can also compact the cache periodically to help improve performance. Simply click the button to do so, and if the cache ever gets corrupted, you can purge it by clicking the Purge Cache button, and then thumbnails and previews would need to be re-rendered for images as you browse them. Next, we have startup scripts, and in most cases you don't need to worry about these settings, but if you have some instability or odd issues, then you might want to disable the startup scripts temporarily to try to troubleshoot the issue. In some cases, for example, a startup script might cause some problems in terms of stability for Bridge. And then finally, we have the advanced section, and here we have, for example, an option to use software rendering. In other words, to not use your graphics processor to generate the thumbnails and previews. This is an option that I would definitely leave turned off because turning it on will slow performance. The only time I would turn it on is if you're experiencing stability issues with Bridge. You can also choose to generate monitor-sized previews. In other words, with the previews rendered based on the largest monitor display size. Note that if you choose to utilize this option, then you'll need to purge the cache in order to regenerate the existing previews. You can also choose to launch Bridge at startup, which makes Bridge more readily available when you do choose to bring it up. But in general, I prefer to minimize the number of applications that are running at any given time, and so I launch Bridge as I need to and leave this checkbox turned off. And then finally, we have language options, both the language of the Bridge interface as well as the keyboard layout, which obviously would be applicable for international purposes. But my language is obviously English, so I'll leave those options set exactly as they are. As you can see, there are a wide variety of options available within the Preferences dialog. Most of the default settings are perfectly fine, but there are some options you may want to evaluate and adjust based on your own personal preferences. Once you've established those settings, you can simply click the OK button in order to apply the changes. When you launch Adobe Bridge for the first time, you'll see a configuration that looks like this. This is called the Essentials workspace, but one of the things that I really appreciate about Adobe Bridge is that you can change the overall workspace to suit your own needs. You can see that we have a set of default panels here. There's the Content panel, the Preview panel, Metadata and Keywords panels, among others. All of those panels can be found on the Window menu. The ones with a check mark indicate that they are currently in use or currently available, and those without a check mark are not currently in use. You can turn a panel on or off simply by selecting it from the Window menu. But first, let's take a look at the other options that are available. The Essentials workspace is the default workspace, but we can switch to other options. You'll notice that we have shortcuts to the workspaces. You can see that Essentials is highlighted. I can click Film Strip to switch to that workspace, Metadata, etc. And there's also a pop-up menu here where we can choose to reset the workspace, create a new workspace, delete a workspace, reset all of the standard workspaces, in other words, those that come by default with Adobe Bridge, and we can also choose among the various workspaces. I'll go ahead and switch to Light Table, for example, and you can see that this is a workspace that focuses on the thumbnail display so that we can see a large number of images all at once. So let's take a look at how we can create our own custom workspace and perform some other tasks related to workspaces. For me personally, I tend to like the Film Strip workspace, although there are some additional options I'd like to add. For example, I like to be able to view the Metadata panel, and so I'm going to go to the Window menu and then choose Metadata panel to bring up that Metadata panel. You can see that it appeared over on the right side, and the problem is that's taking up a fair amount of space. I can adjust how much space is allocated to that metadata panel by dragging the dividing line to the left or right, but even making it smaller is not going to help much because it still takes up some space here, and now I can't really see most of the information on it. So instead, I'd like to move the metadata panel to a different location. The Favorites and Folders panels I use fairly frequently, but once I've navigated to a specific folder, I don't necessarily need to be able to switch to another folder right away. And so I think it makes sense to have the metadata panel here. That way I can utilize the filter panel, for example, to help filter the images in the current folder, and then select an image and view the metadata for that image. So I'm going to move that metadata panel by dragging the tab for the metadata panel to a new location. You'll notice as I move the mouse around that I get a blue highlight indicating where that panel will end up when I release the mouse. So I'll hover my mouse over the area where I want that panel to appear, and then I will release the mouse button, and you can see that metadata panel has moved. That's left an empty space in the right pane, so I'll go ahead and drag that dividing line over toward the far right in order to reclaim that space, so now I can see a larger version of my preview image. Now that I've customized this workspace a little bit to my own liking, I'll go ahead and save it. I'll go to the Window menu and choose Workspace followed by New Workspace. That will bring up the New Workspace dialog. I'll just type my name since this is my workspace, but of course you might also use a name that is indicative of the task you're going to perform with that particular workspace. For example, if you use one workspace when you're updating keywords and metadata and a different workspace when you're looking for specific images, you could name those workspaces accordingly. I'll also save the window location as part of the workspace, and also the sort order. This can be helpful in situations where the sort order is critical to a particular task, for example. With those options established, I'll go ahead and click the Save button, and you can see that my workspace has been created. So now I can switch between my various workspaces, but always get back to my own personal workspace. And if I make any changes, let's say for example I inadvertently get rid of one of the panels that I actually want, I'll go to the Window menu and for example turn off the Folders panel. That will make it a little difficult for me to navigate among my folders, so I certainly want that panel back. But if I'm not sure exactly what I need to bring back, in other words, I'm not sure which panels were lost, then I can simply reset the workspace. So I'll go to the Window menu and choose Workspace. You can see that the Tim Gray workspace is currently active, but it's been modified also, so it doesn't actually completely reflect that saved workspace. But I can choose Reset Workspace to reset that workspace back to the saved settings, so you can see that the metadata panel is back. If you've created multiple workspaces, from time to time you may find that you have an extraneous workspace, in which case you can go to the Window menu, choose Workspace, and then choose Delete Workspace. You may have noticed that this option was not available initially, and that's because you cannot delete the workspaces that are included with Bridge by default. So until you create your own custom workspace, this option won't be available. But you can choose Delete Workspace and then choose your specific saved workspace from the pop-up if you do want to delete it, in which case you can simply click the Delete button. But of course, in this case, I don't want to delete this workspace, so I'll just click the Cancel button. You may very well find that one of the workspaces included with Bridge works perfectly well for your needs, but if not, rest assured that you can fine-tune the overall layout of the Bridge interface and save your own workspaces as needed. In addition to being able to adjust the overall panel layout and save a workspace reflecting that layout, Bridge also allows you to adjust a variety of other view options. Let's take a look at some of those settings. We'll start off by taking a look at the View menu, and on that View menu you'll see that there are a variety of options. So we can choose between Full Screen Preview, Slideshow, and Review Mode, for example. We can also choose if we want to view our images as thumbnails, as a details display, or as a list display. We can choose to show only the thumbnail, not, for example, the file name below the thumbnail. We can lock the grid for the thumbnails so that thumbnails are never cut off as we zoom in or out. We can also choose whether we want rejected files to be displayed versus hidden, and also whether we want to view hidden files, so those with the hidden attribute in your operating system. We can specify whether we want folders contained within the current folder to be displayed, or if we only want to view images. And we can also turn on an option to display all items, including from subfolders inside the current folder. We also have a variety of sorting options. We can sort by file name, for example, or the resolution of the image if you want to. And then we can choose whether we want to sort in ascending versus descending order by turning on or off the ascending order checkbox. And then we also have an option to refresh the display. So if something doesn't look quite right, for example, you can force Adobe Bridge to refresh the on-screen display. These options are obviously all relatively straightforward, but most of the key settings that you're likely to use can actually be found outside of the menu itself. For example, we can adjust our sorting by clicking an option on the toolbar. Just click the pop-up and choose the sort order, and then choose ascending versus descending. We can also switch between the thumbnail display, the details display, or the list display by choosing one of the buttons at the bottom right of the bridge display. And when we're working with thumbnails, we can also specify if we want to lock the grid. When we have the grid locked, you'll see that we have an available space that fits each thumbnail, so that we don't have a thumbnail that's cut off. I'll turn that option off for a moment, and then zoom the display of my thumbnails, and you can see that as I zoom, some of those thumbnails get cut off. If I turn on the grid lock option, then you'll see that the images fit within the available space with none of those thumbnails cut off. Even as I zoom in or out in order to adjust the thumbnail size, you'll see that the thumbnails are not cut off. In addition to using the slider to adjust the thumbnail size, we can also reduce the size of thumbnails by clicking the button to the left of the slider, or increase the size of thumbnails by clicking the button to the right of the slider. So as you can see, we have a variety of options for changing the overall view settings within Adobe Bridge based on our personal preference or the particular task we're performing at any given time. When you browse your photos with Bridge, a thumbnail and preview will be generated for those images. And that enables a faster experience browsing your images. The first time you browse a folder, the thumbnails and previews will be generated, so that the second time you browse a folder, there's no need to regenerate those previews. They can be displayed instantly. From time to time, though, you may need to purge the cache of those thumbnails and previews. For example, you may find a situation where some of the previews have become corrupted and no longer reflect accurately the contents of the image, or you may find that the cache is just consuming too much hard drive space and you need to free up some of that space. There are a couple of options for purging the cache. If you just have a problem with the images in a single folder, then you can simply choose Tools from the menu, followed by Cache, and then Purge Cache for Folder. And you'll see, of course, that the name of the current folder is indicated there. When you choose this option, the thumbnails and previews will need to be re-rendered. In this case, that process takes virtually no time at all because there are only 18 images here and they're relatively small JPEG images. For a large collection of raw captures, that process may involve a little bit more time, but once that process is complete, you'll be able to browse among your photos very quickly. If you have a larger issue, for example, you need to clear out the overall cache so that you can free up some hard drive space, you can purge the entire cache for the entire Bridge catalog. To do so, we'll go to Preferences. So on Windows, we can choose Edit Preferences, and on Macintosh, we can choose Bridge Preferences. In the Preferences dialog, we'll go to the Cache section, and then we can click the Purge Cache button. You'll be asked for a confirmation that you really do want to purge the cache. If you click OK, that cache will be purged for all of the images that are in the current cache. You can then click OK to close the Preferences dialog, and as you browse to various folders, the thumbnails and previews will be regenerated. For most photographers, there's not really much need to purge the cache for a single folder or for Bridge in its entirety, but every now and then you may find that it becomes necessary for one reason or another, and so it's helpful to know where those options exist. Adobe Bridge is used primarily to manage your digital photos, and of course that means you're going to need to navigate among the various folders where your images are stored and move through the various images to review them. Let's take a look at the various options that are available within Adobe Bridge for navigating among your images. I'm currently browsing a South Africa folder, but you can see on the Folders panel that I also have access to the other folders that are adjacent to that South Africa folder. I can also navigate up to a higher location or just to a different folder in general. I can even navigate among the various drives on my computer. So, for example, I can see all of the additional hard drives attached to my computer, and I can go to the desktop as well to look for images there. The point is that I can navigate among all of the various locations on my internal hard drive, attached external hard drives, network locations, etc., all through that Folders panel. As needed, I can collapse or expand the individual folders that are displayed on that folders panel. I can do that just by clicking the triangle to the left of any of the drives, folders, or other locations that are indicated. In addition to the folders panel, I can also utilize the favorites panel. You can add items to the favorites panel, but by default you'll have access to your computer, the desktop, the My Pictures folder, etc. I'll go ahead and navigate to the desktop, for example, and then choose a particular folder that I want to browse. Once I've navigated to a particular folder, you'll notice that I have an indication of that folder's location on the toolbar. In addition to providing some information about where I'm currently browsing, I can also navigate by clicking on a parent folder. So, for example, I can click on the Exercise Files folder or the Desktop folder in order to navigate among those locations. If I actually didn't want to go all the way back to the desktop, but rather wanted to be in the Exercise Files folder, I can't actually navigate to it right here because it's not displayed. I can certainly use the Content panel, but since the Exercise Files folder is the last folder I was in, I can also click the Back button. And once I've gone back, I can also go forward, much like you would navigate backward and forward using a web browser. When you navigate to a particular folder, an image will not be selected by default. And so to actually navigate among your images, or to view a preview of one of those images, you'll need to click on that image to make it active. And of course, I can click on any of the images on the Content panel in order to view that image in the Preview panel, but I can also navigate using keyboard shortcuts. For example, I can press the Home key to go to the first image in the Content panel, and I can press the End key to go to the last image. In most cases, I would start reviewing images with the first image, so that Home key shortcut can be very helpful. I can then use the arrow keys to navigate through the images, pressing the right arrow key to go to the next image or the left arrow key to go to the previous image. Once you're able to navigate around among the various folders and navigate among the individual images, you'll be able to review those images in order to keep them organized and find just the image you need.